just get lots of people to put solar panels on their roofs.
Mhm.
And that disperses the power production, and there's less reliance on the power grid, so you have more reliability. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on that.
Okay, so there are kind of two issues that are being blended together, which are both interesting issues. So one is the issue of centralized, what's called centralized power versus distributed power. So, originally it was a really great achievement by Edison to put, let's say the coal, the steam engines in one place and then distribute it out to various people. And one reason for that was economies of scale. You could make one plant that had, really high specification. You only needed a certain amount of people running it, and people didn't need to run their own coal plants. They didn't need to fix their own coal plants. So there are all sorts of, whenever you do distributed generation to a certain point, what you do is you place a lot of burden on the individual. And in the case of something like solar, that is both burden of maintenance, so he has to dust off the solar panels, and it's also a burden of risk because people have to go up on their roofs and falling off. This seems funny, but it's really not. Accidental falls are one of the leading causes of death. So plus you've got risks of children, getting in touch with the batteries. Again, energy is an inherently potentially dangerous thing. So distributed generation has issues with it. Now, what I think is more potent is kind of a semi-distributed, where I've heard of like small, really safe nuclear reactors where they can bury it like the kind you would use in a submarine, which our armed forces use safely for decades. You stick that in the ground somewhere and it'll give a community a couple decades worth of power. That sounds much more promising because it's still distributed. It's just not quite. It's centralized, but it's just not as centralized. So there are a lot of issues with our grid. And part of the issue is that it's run by government, and there are strong cases to be made for that not to be the case, but it gets pretty technical. But in terms of solar, it doesn't really solve it to be distributed. So first of all, it's expensive. So whenever you lose a lot of economies of scale when you put them all on individual roofs. But think about the scale that you're talking about. You're saying, well, we want them to be decentralized. But that means you're basically dealing with locals. Well, his son and my son and your son in this area are not that different. So what'll happen is it's just a form of intermittency, and what'll happen is people, during the peak hours of the day, it might power their air conditioning and it might give a little bit of extra. And I should just say there's nothing to say that there's no value, particular to solar at all. Let me stress this. There is actually value to solar in particular, and that is if you're off the grid. If you're off the grid, it can be worth it to have pretty low power, to have a decent battery there, and you can run kind of a mild home. That's different than running an industrial civilization. So all of these things should be determined by the free market. So it's not as if I'm saying, hey, my plan is everyone should use nuclear. No, my plan is get rid of all the plants. Gentleman behind green and then green.
Well, I think you mentioned that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that Governor Perry was in favor of building wind farms in Texas?
Yes.
Okay, and I think that he's well documented as being, not even believing that the climate is changing due to anthropogenic forcing.
Uh-huh.
And so could you maybe speculate as to why he would support wind power while at the same time not believing in climate change or human forces?
He's a politician. I mean, that's. But there's an element.
Does he have an alliance with the Green Organization, for example?
I mean, I'm certainly not I'm sure people here know more about Perry than I do. But remember that part of the green energy rhetoric is that this is actually economic. And Perry doesn't strike me as the kind of person who's researched every single issue in depth and would never make an unprincipled decision. So I think he just sees it as, oh, the government's giving money, this will make us look good. And it has an industrial character. We're building a lot of things. This is the future. Maybe T. Boone Pickens is whispering in his ear. I don't know. I mean, it's not an economic form of power generation. It's been proven in his own state. And I think he thought, I mean, a lot of the calculation is, well, I can get away with it. This will pander to some of the Greens, the people who are concerned about global warming. But then, of course, I'm going to say I don't believe in it, to pander to my base. And I don't mean pander. I mean, he must believe one or the other. But
To further clarify that, maybe to touch touch on this question. It may not be that he necessarily believes it's better, but there's power and redundancy. So 8.7% is better than 0% if electrical
No,
fails.
no.
But to answer his question, I mean, the view he may have taken is if you lose electrical, what, you know.
But the question, it's always a question of you're making a trade-off. So the question is, if you've got hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in redundant energy, why are you going to use gusts of wind? And it doesn't make any sense.
I don't have an answer.
No, so it's again, it's just a rational, but
Yeah.
so I mean, it's just a rationalization. Gentleman in the green.
Yeah, I wasn't planning to actually ask a question, but basically on your point about the distributed energy, it turns out my brother actually put solar panels on his house, and it turns out one time he was bragging that he produced, about 3 kilowatt hours a day. And of course, he has the expertise to build that and operate it, and the average person wouldn't. And so I don't know how many people you get along with about 90 kilowatt hours a month for a house.
Yeah, that's not what I
That
want.
wouldn't even be enough to run the air conditioner. I remember one time he was gone, and apparently there was a power outage. So his wife called my mom, and even my mom knew, no, you can't turn on the air conditioner. And that's even though he had 8 batteries that I think were like 800 gallons each. He got from decommissioned cell phone towers to store power.
Yeah, and
Again, the average person wouldn't have that resource.
it's serious stuff, and we're really lucky in terms of the world we live in. We just turn on a switch and we know there's going to be light, and if there's a blackout, we know it's going to disappear. But I title this talk, the green blackout, because it's really rough. I mean, to say the least, living without power. And a guy emailed me on Facebook the other day just saying, I'm the world's biggest opponent of solar homes because I've lived in one for 10 or 20 years. And he just said, yeah, I'm constantly having to make these tiny little calculations about, can I afford to run the dryer? Can I afford to turn on the lights? And we should not be at the stage where we're making those calculations. I mean, the country of Edison should not be in that state. There's no technical reason why we need to be there. There's only bad philosophical reasons why we're heading there.
I've heard people make the claim that if we took all the subsidies from, like fossil fuels and just pretty much took all those and put it all into solar and wind, then we could, power, the entire United States with just that. What would your response to that be?
Not using inappropriate words. I mean, so it doesn't matter how much subsidies you have, they still haven't solved the intermittency problem. But I really hate when energy speakers come and they just kind of give you a bunch of statistics that you can't verify. So I tried to just give you some basic facts about the world energy picture that are pretty easy to look up. And also just encourage you to think of it with some common sense. So let's say the US has subsidies on coal, oil, natural gas, and nuclear, and those exceed the subsidies on solar and wind. And none of that is true, by the way. On a per unit energy generated basis, solar and wind are somewhere around 100 times as much as fossil fuels. And it's even arguable whether fossil fuels get subsidies because they have to pay so much in taxes on various things. But even if they were over-subsidized in this country, what would that mean about every single other country? Well, how would that change the world energy picture? Why isn't Spain becoming prosperous on green energy? Because we're not subsidizing it? So it doesn't make any sense. It's like people say, oh, if only we didn't subsidize oil so much, we wouldn't use oil. Really? If we didn't produce any oil, the world would use oil. So it's helpful to just really kind of critically think about these assertions, and they do not add up. I mean, the fact is that these are enormously expensive ways to generate energy. They've been given subsidies, and if you can claim, what you should do is just say, take all subsidies away and see what happens. That's what I'm in favor of. Now, in the case of fossil fuels, I think often the subsidies come at a very large price, whereas the green subsidies are much more just like, I'll scratch your back and scratch it again. I mean, it's just that kind of dynamic where just billions and billions of dollars are being thrown at this stuff. But the stuff is impractical in every single location in the world. So the subsidies of one country or another is not an explanation for it.
I just wanted to clarify something. You said for redundancy, you get rid of the intermittency problem. problem? You want to build more fossil fuel plants? Is that it?
No, no, so the issue, I mean, this is, I don't know how much clarification, because this was a clarification on a clarification. But the issue was, would wind qualify as providing redundancy for the regular power infrastructure? So that's primarily a fossil fuel infrastructure. My argument was no. If you wanted redundancy, you would actually have a practical, reliable source. You wouldn't have an intermittent source. That's it.